everyone thought I was bitter, obsessed. That's the word that clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Obsessed. As if I were some jealous ex who couldn't move on. But tell me, what would you do if the man you thought you'd marry dumped you, replaced you in record time, and then had the audacity to invite you to his wedding? My name's Emily. I'm 29, and if you'd met me a year ago, you would have thought I had it all figured out. A solid job, close friends, and a relationship people envied. The kind that looked perfect on Instagram, inside jokes and captions, vacation selfies. The kind that made people say, "You're so lucky." What no one saw were the cracks. The phone turned face down. The nights of silence, the dinners canceled, the smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. For the sake of this story, we'll call him Tim. Tim wasn't fireworks when I met him. He was steady, grounding, the kind of man who made me feel like maybe, finally, I could stop running to prove I was worthy of love. And I believed in him. In us. In the future we planned together. Which is why the breakup didn't just sting, it gutted me. Because weeks after leaving me with the line, "I can't give you the future you deserve," Tim wasn't grieving or figuring himself out. He was smiling in photos with another woman, not just dating, engaged, and then came the wedding invitation. That's not closure, that's cruelty. Because heartbreak isn't just losing love, it's being erased from a story you thought you were still part of. I met Tim 3 summers ago at a friend's barbecue. I almost didn't go. I'd had one of those weeks where work piles up until you can barely drag yourself out of bed, let alone put on a smile. But my best friend insisted, and that's where I saw him. He wasn't the kind of man who turned heads instantly. No big entrances or practiced charm. He was quieter, steadier. At the grill, laughing easily with strangers, flipping burgers like the world couldn't touch him. Later, he sat next to me and asked about the book I was reading. Actually asked, like he cared about the answer. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like we were picking up the middle of a story instead of starting a new one. After a string of chaotic, performative relationships, Tim's calm felt like safety. Coffee turned into dinner, dinner into a midnight walk, and soon I was caught up in the quiet certainty of him. We built a life together. 4 years of inside jokes, silly rituals, holidays spent dreaming about the future. He left sticky notes on the fridge, remembered how I took my coffee, teased me when I hummed without realizing. We talked about kids. He wanted a boy. I wanted a girl. And how we'd probably end up with both. We stopped outside a jewelry shop once, joking about someday, and I clung to that word like it was a promise. But cracks don't show up as explosions. They slip in quietly. A phone suddenly face down on the table. Work piling up, more often than before. Canceled dinners and last-minute excuses that sounded reasonable, even as my chest tightened. I asked once, and he chuckled, kissed my forehead, told me I was overthinking. And I believed him. Because love makes you want to believe. The end came without warning. No screaming match, no slammed doors, just silence broken by one sentence. We were sitting on the couch, half watching TV, when Tim turned to me, eyes fixed on some distant point, and said, "I need space. I can't give you the future you deserve." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for him to laugh, to tell me he was just tired, that we could talk it through. But he didn't. He just sat there, steady and calm, while the life I thought we were building crumbled in my hands. In the days after, I waited for the call, the late-night text, the knock on my door. Breakups usually come with second chances, with begging and bargaining, with at least some mess to make it feel real. But with Tim, nothing. Just absence. His jacket still hung on the chair. His mug still sat in the sink. The apartment looked like he belonged there, except he didn't. Then, just weeks later, came the photos. Tim, smiling with his arm around another woman. Not just dating, engaged. Her hand on his chest, a diamond flashing on her finger. His captions filled with love and promises. Promises he once made to me. The comments rolled in. "Congratulations! So happy for you." True love. While I sat frozen, staring at the screen like it might rewrite itself if I waited long enough. Friends told me to let it go. "He's moved on. You should too." My best friend said, "You're obsessing, Em. He's happy now. Don't torture yourself." But they didn't see what I saw. People don't meet, fall in love, and get engaged in a matter of weeks. Rings don't appear out of nowhere, which meant that while I was still picturing our future, our house, our kids, our forever, Tim was already building a life with her. That was the thought I couldn't shake, the seed that planted itself deep in my chest. Because it wasn't just that he moved on fast, it was that he must have started moving on long before he ever left me. The first real crack came from a photo. It was one of those harmless group shots a mutual friend had posted. Everyone squeezed around a restaurant table, arms draped, glasses raised. At first glance, nothing unusual. But when I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There was Tim, and right next to him, her, the fiancé. The kicker? The date stamp. That photo was taken while Tim and I were still together. I stared at it until the edges blurred, trying to convince myself it was innocent. Maybe they were just friends. Maybe it was coincidence. Heartbreak makes you desperate to protect yourself from the obvious truth. And then came the necklace. I'd once seen it lying on his dresser, a delicate silver chain with a tiny pendant. When I asked, he said his sister had left it there. I believed him because, why wouldn't I? But weeks later, scrolling through photos of his new fiancée, I froze. She was wearing it. The exact necklace. By then, denial was a luxury I couldn't afford. The final blow came from an acquaintance at a bar. Not a close friend, just someone who'd been around enough to know. After a few drinks, they leaned in and said quietly, "You deserve to know. Tim was already seeing her before you two broke up." The words landed like a hammer. Not speculation, not suspicion, confirmation. In that moment, every puzzle piece locked into place. The photo, the receipt, the necklace, the engagement. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't obsession. It was betrayal. Long before the breakup, armed with the photo, the receipt, the necklace, and even the whispered confirmation, I finally confronted Tim. I thought if I laid everything out calmly, he'd have no choice but to admit it. I rehearsed the words in my head, my voice steady, the evidence clear. But Tim didn't flinch. He laughed. Not the laugh I used to love. This one was sharp, cruel, dismissive. "You're crazy, Emily. You always do this. You twist things around until you believe your own stories." I pushed harder, my hands shaking, my voice cracking. He just leaned back on the couch, arms folded, smiling like he'd already won. "You sound obsessed. This isn't healthy." That word, obsessed, hit harder than the breakup, because it was exactly how people had started looking at me, and Tim knew it. It didn't stop there. He got ahead of the story. He told friends, family, anyone who would listen. "She can't let go. She keeps accusing me of things that never happened. I feel sorry for her, but she's not stable." And people believed him, or at least, they acted like they did. Friends who used to text me every day went silent. Others gave me short, polite replies, as if they didn't want to get caught in the middle. A few even hinted that maybe Tim was right, that maybe I was overreacting. So suddenly, I wasn't just losing Tim. I was losing everyone. And that's how gaslighting works. It doesn't just make you doubt him. It makes you doubt yourself. I lay awake night after night, replaying everything. The photo, the necklace, the receipt. They were real. I knew they were real. But his voice echoed in my head. "You're paranoid. You're obsessed. You're crazy." To keep my sanity, I started journaling. Dates, times, details. Anything that would tether me to reality. But even then, I'd stare at the pages, wondering if I was stretching the truth. Because when enough people side with the lie, you start questioning the truth you lived yourself. And I hated it. But part of me began to wonder if maybe he was right. I never should have gone to the wedding. Every sane voice around me said the same. Why torture yourself? Delete the invite. Move on. But closure doesn't come from pretending. It comes from facing the truth head on, even if it burns. So, when the ivory envelope arrived, names embossed in gold, Tim's and hers linked together like they'd always been, I tucked it in a drawer. For weeks, I pulled it out, running my fingers over the letters like they might cut me. And in the end, I decided I had to go. Not to make a scene, not to sabotage, just to see with my own eyes what denial had kept blurry. The venue was perfect. White flowers draped across arches, fairy lights twinkling like stars. The kind of place Tim and I once dreamed about for someday. Only someday wasn't mine anymore. I slipped into the back row, clutching the program until it crumpled in my hands. My chest tightened as I spotted him at the altar, smiling, radiant, adjusting his tie like this was the happiest day of his life. And then it happened. Two women in front of me whispered, their voices barely above the music. "Can you believe he bought the ring months before they broke up?" One murmured. My ears rang. My heart pounded so hard I thought the whole chapel could hear it. "Yeah," the other replied. "He told me he couldn't wait. Said he had to lock her down." Lock her down. The words sliced through me, because in that instant, everything clicked into place. The photo, the necklace, the receipt. It wasn't just that Tim moved on fast, it was that he'd already chosen her while he was still with me. I wasn't left behind. I was replaced. The ceremony blurred after that. His vows, tender, devoted, were the same ones he once whispered to me. The applause, the kiss, the cheers, it all felt like watching my own erasure play out in real time. And I sat frozen, invisible in the back row, realizing I wasn't a guest at his wedding. I was the ghost of the life he'd already rewritten without me. I could have left after the ceremony, slipped out the back before anyone noticed. That would have been the sane choice. But sanity wasn't what brought me there. Closure was. So I stayed. Dinner, speeches, endless clinking of glasses. It was all a blur. But when I saw Tim step out into a quiet hallway lined with coats and flowers, I followed. My hands trembled, but my voice was steady. "Congratulations," I said. He flinched. The smile he'd worn all night faltered. "Emily, you shouldn't be here." "Oh, but I was invited," I replied, holding up the crumpled program like proof. And I thought, why not see the fairy tale for myself? His jaw tightened. "Look, I don't want a scene. This is my wedding day." "Funny," I said, pulling papers from my bag, "because when you bought that ring, you were still my boyfriend." I spread the evidence between us like cards in a deck. The group photo, the receipt, the necklace. His face drained of color. He tried to laugh, then to deny, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, he broke. His voice was low, almost bitter. "Fine. You want the truth?" I wanted both. "You were safe. She was exciting. I thought I could keep it together." There it was. The confession. But before I could respond, a voice behind us cut through the air. "Is that true?" We both turned. His bride stood frozen in the doorway, veil trembling, eyes wide. Tim stammered, reaching for her. "No, baby, it's not." But it was too late. The mask was gone. I gathered my papers, tucked them back into my bag, and stepped aside. "Enjoy your happily ever after," I said, and then I walked away, leaving him to drown in the wreckage of his own lies. For the first time, I felt calm. After that night, I didn't look back. I didn't call Tim. I didn't check his socials. I didn't ask mutual friends for updates about whether the marriage survived past the honeymoon. For the first time since the breakup, I didn't need answers from him, because I finally had the only one that mattered. It wasn't me. It was never me. So I cut ties. Not just with Tim, but with the people who'd swallowed his story whole. The friends who whispered behind my back, the ones who told me to move on while defending him. They all belonged to the same lie, and I wasn't living in it anymore. Instead, I poured that energy back into myself. I booked a solo trip, walked new streets with nobody's voice in my head but my own. I went to therapy, where I learned anger and grief aren't proof of obsession. They're proof of survival. I cooked for myself again, not the meals I thought would impress him, but the ones that comforted me. Slowly, I rediscovered the version of Emily that existed before him. And the weight lifted. Piece by piece, I felt free. Tim thought marrying her meant he'd won. But if you have to lie your way to the altar, you're already living a divorce. He moved on fast. But I moved on free. And that's the part no one tells you about heartbreak. It doesn't just destroy. It clears the rubble so you can finally build something real.